On the afternoon of March 23, 2019, the cruise ship Viking Sky faced a power outage in a barrage of strong winds, with gusts reaching up to 29 meters per second, while it was in the area of Hustadvika along the Norwegian coast. This power loss caused the ship to lose its ability to move forward and steer, and with over 1,300 people aboard, the ship came dangerously close to running aground, which could have resulted in one of the worst maritime disasters in recent history. Here is the inside story. On the afternoon of March 23, 2019, the cruise ship Viking Sky was sailing from Tromsø when it suddenly lost power and steering. This happened in an area along the Norwegian coast called Hustadvika, where strong winds of about 24 meters per second were blowing, with gusts reaching up to 29 meters per second. This equates to wind speeds that are of a really strong breeze. Because of the blackout, the ship couldn't control its movement and started drifting dangerously close to the shore. The captain immediately called for emergency assistance, known as a Mayday signal. The Viking Sky was a large cruise ship, measuring 228.3 meters in length. It used a type of engine called diesel-electric propulsion. This means it generated power using diesel fuel to run electric motors that moved the ship. It was built by a company called Fincantieri in Italy and was put into service in January 2017. The Viking Sky was part of a group of similar cruise ships called the Viking Star class. By the time of the incident, 7 other ships of the same class had joined the fleet, with more expected to follow. This ship was allowed to carry up to 954 passengers, but it could accommodate a maximum of 1,453 people, including passengers and crew. At the time of the incident, there were 915 passengers and 459 crew members, making a total of 1,374 people on board. Most of the passengers were from the United States, with 602 Americans on board, followed by the United Kingdom with 197. There were smaller numbers from various other countries, with the third majority of 69 passengers coming out of Australia. The Viking Sky was owned by a company called Viking Ocean Cruises, and its technical management was handled by Wilhelmsen Ship Management. It was registered in Norway and flew the Norwegian flag. The Norwegian Maritime Authority was responsible for overseeing safety and environmental protection on ships registered in Norway. The MV Viking Sky embarked on its final Northern Lights cruise from Bergen on March 14, 2019. This journey included stops at ports like Alta, Tromsø, Bodø, and Stavanger. Leaving Tromsø at around 10 p.m. on March 21st, it was due to arrive in Bodø by March 22nd. After Bodø, the plan was to visit Stavanger on March 24th, before heading to London, the last stop of the trip. When the ship departed Tromsø, it had 2 licensed Norwegian coastal pilots on board. These pilots were required for certain parts of the journey. Both had experience with the Viking Sky and knew the ship and crew well. During the trip, one of the ship's 4 diesel generator sets, called DG3, was not working because of a recent issue with its turbocharger. Parts to fix it were expected to be delivered in Stavanger, and a technician was already on board to prepare for the repair. Before leaving Tromsø, the captain, along with the bridge team and pilots, reviewed the planned route. They considered the missing engine and the expected weather conditions, and they knew strong winds and rough seas were predicted. The weather was actually initially good, but at 1:11 a.m., while passing a nearby island, an alarm went off, indicating low lubricating oil in DG2. It was quickly addressed, and the journey continued without major incidents. By the time they reached Bodø, the captain was concerned about worsening weather conditions and the difficulty of leaving the port. So, they decided to skip Bodø and head straight for Stavanger. Passengers were informed of this change. As they sailed towards Stavanger, the crew was instructed to prepare for worsening weather. The ship encountered strong winds and high waves on its way to Trondheim, so the speed was reduced to make the journey smoother. Entering the Trondheim fairway on March 23rd, around 6 a.m., the ship faced strong gale-force winds. Despite this, they proceeded, expecting conditions to worsen later on. During certain watch periods, the ship's alarm system registered several alarms, including low lubricating oil level alarms again. These were acknowledged by the engineer on watch and resolved without further action. When the MV Viking Sky passed Kristiansand just before noon, one of the pilots left because he only had authorization to navigate up to that point. A new pilot was expected to join the ship when it reached Ålesund. Meanwhile, the captain informed passengers about the upcoming weather through the ship's announcement system. Around 12:30 p.m., as the ship entered Hustadvika, the wind speed averaged about 30 meters per second, with gusts up to 41 meters per second. The wind and waves hit the ship from the right side, and the waves were between 4 and 6 meters high, with occasional higher waves. Despite this, the crew continued with their usual tasks, and lunch service continued for the passengers. At 1:17 p.m., the crew completed a checklist to prepare for heavy weather, which included various tasks related to navigation, communication, stability, and engine maintenance. Starting around 1:30 p.m., more sea spray was noticed, and the ship's rolling increased to about 3 to 4 degrees, with occasional movements up to 6 degrees. At 1:37 p.m., alarms went off yet again, indicating low lubricating oil pressure and automatic load reduction in one of the engines, DG4. This meant the engine wasn't getting enough oil to run properly. The alarms were acknowledged, but didn't trigger any further action. A similar alarm occurred in another engine, DG1, but at 1:40 p.m., it was quickly resolved. Despite these alarms, both the pilot and the officer on watch seemed relaxed, chatting on the bridge. In the passenger areas, service continued as usual. However, at 1:45 p.m., DG4 shut down, followed shortly by DG2. These shutdowns were due to the low oil pressure issue. Around 50 alarms sounded in the engine room, and the chief engineer was informed about the situation, arriving at the engine control room about 6 minutes later. The ship's speeds dropped below 6 knots, causing the stabilizers to retract automatically, making the ship's movements worse in the rough seas. Roll angles increased to 4 to 6 degrees, with occasional movements all the way up to 12 degrees. The crew began clearing unused tables in the restaurants. At 1:56 p.m., DG2 was successfully restarted, and the stabilizers were manually deployed. But less than 3 minutes later, at 1:58 p.m., both DG1 and DG2 shut down, causing a complete blackout and loss of propulsion and steering for the ship. Enter the madness of the Viking Sky. Immediately after the blackout, around 1,000 alarms went off in the engine room due to the sudden loss of power. Luckily, the emergency diesel generator kicked in within 4 seconds, providing power to the emergency switchboard just 16 seconds later. Meanwhile, on the bridge, more alarms blared, and some loose equipment fell because of the ship's sudden movement. The bridge team quickly realized that all the engines had stopped and contacted the engine control room to find out how long it would take to get them running again. However, the engineers couldn't figure out the cause of the shutdowns right away, so they couldn't estimate how long it would take to fix the problem. Seeing the seriousness in the situation, the captain sent out a distress signal, known as a mayday, at 2:00 p.m. He then instructed the crew to drop both anchors to try to stop the ship from drifting further. The crew worked to lower both anchors, but despite putting out a good length of anchor chain, the anchors didn't hold, and the ship continued to drift towards the shore at about 4 knots. The wind was blowing at an average speed of 24 meters per second, with gusts up to 35 meters per second. Rescue operations were immediately launched by the Joint Rescue Coordination Center as the ship continued to experience intense rolling movements, with angles reaching up to 14 degrees. Inside the ship, furniture slid across the floors, and ceiling plates fell in some areas, causing chaos among passengers. Back in the engine room, engineers tried to restart the diesel generators, but their efforts were unsuccessful. After some time, they suspected that the shutdowns might be due to the low oil pressure. Around 2:12 p.m., they started transferring oil from the storage tank to the engine's oil sump tanks, prioritizing the largest engine, DG2. After being restarted, the diesel generators, referred to as DGs, kept shutting down because they still had active alarms indicating low oil pressure. When the oil level became enough to ensure a steady supply of oil to the engine's pump, the pressure finally went back to normal, and the alarm stopped. However, to start the engines remotely, the control system needed the alarm to be reset locally and in the engine control room. Several attempts to restart and connect the engines to the switchboard failed because these specific steps weren't done in the right order. Also, the engine speeds had to match for them to be connected to the main switchboard and work together. This was tricky because the load on the engines changed with the weather conditions. At 2:13 p.m., the general alarm was activated, and passengers and crew started gathering in designated areas. One of the pilots took charge of communicating with the rescue personnel, while the staff captain prepared for the possible evacuation of passengers by helicopter. The captain stayed in touch with the authorities on land and kept passengers informed through the ship's announcement system. At 2:22 p.m., DG2 was successfully restarted and connected to the main switchboard in manual control mode. Around this time, the ship was very close to shallow areas and rocks. 5 minutes later, the ship drifted over a rock marked at the depth of 10 meters, even though the ship's draft, or how deep it sits in the water, was about 6.5 meters. The engineer's main goal at this point was to get the propulsion motors and propellers running to prevent the ship from hitting the ground. By 2:31 p.m., the portside propulsion motor was connected. By around 2:37 p.m., both propulsion motors were working, providing enough power to maintain a speed of 1 to 5 knots forward. At this point, the ship was dangerously close to running aground, within the length of the ship itself. After the captain asked for help, the chief engineer took manual control of the propulsion motors to avoid them shutting down due to moving in rough seas. An electrician was on standby to quickly reset the motors if needed. The bridge had power for lights and communication systems, and the captain kept everyone updated using the PA system. He told passengers not to use the lifts and informed them about the possibility of helicopter evacuations. At 3:24 and 3:46 p.m., 2 of the diesel generators, DG4 and DG1, were restarted and connected to share the load automatically. However, because the ship was close to shallow waters and there were concerns about the engine control room, they didn't want to risk another blackout by switching the third generator, DG2, to automatic mode. So, DG2 remained in manual mode. This resulted in DG1 and DG4 taking most of the load. After the distress signal at 2:00 p.m., the Joint Rescue Coordination Center organized a rescue team led by the police. Their job was to manage and coordinate the rescue efforts. The rescue operation, including helicopter rescues and passenger evacuation, is detailed in a report by the Norwegian Directorate for Civil Protection. The Norwegian Safety Investigation Authority focused on the ship's activities and how the rescue operation worked with the vessel. Helicopters and rescue vessels were dispatched immediately after the distress call. The Coast Guard vessel left Christiansand at 2:15 p.m. and headed toward the ship. On board, 2 assembly points were set up, one in the theater at the front of deck, or Assembly Station A, and one in the main restaurant at the back of Deck 2, or Assembly Station B. Passengers gathered at these points after the alarm sounded at 2:13 p.m. At 2:26 p.m., Viking Sky reported to the JRCC that it had dropped both anchors, but they didn't hold. The ship requested evacuation by helicopter. However, due to the weather, it was deemed too risky to use lifeboats or transfer passengers to other ships. So, the decision was made to evacuate purely by helicopter. Around 3:00 p.m., the ship was hit by a series of large waves. One wave smashed a door between the starboard side and the outer embarkation deck, injuring some passengers. Cold seawater flooded into the assembly station, causing chaos and injuries. Passengers were moved to safer areas. Helicopters were supposed to pick up passengers from the port side of Deck 8, but the bad weather and ship movements made it too risky. An alternative area for evacuation was considered, but also deemed too dangerous. 6 rescue helicopters were involved in evacuating passengers. The closest helicopter took off from Kristiansand, about 40 kilometers away. The other 5 helicopters came from bases along the coast, from Stavanger in the south to Arlanda in the north. The first helicopter arrived above the ship at 3:03 p.m. The crew positioned the vessel to make it easier for helicopters to evacuate passengers. After assessing the situation, they were ready to start hoisting passengers up. The first hoisting operation began about 1 hour and 20 minutes after the distress call. Injured passengers and a rescue crewman were lifted together. And to speed up the process, some rescues were done as tandem lifts. Eventually, a crewman was stationed aboard to organize the rescue efforts. The helicopters shuttled back and forth between Viking Sky and a reception center on shore, about 2 kilometers away, to drop off passengers and refuel. This way, they could keep the rescue operation running smoothly. The Coast Guard vessel arrived at 4:40 p.m. to coordinate the rescue efforts, and the tugboat Vivix arrived at 5:05 p.m. and stayed nearby to help the ship move slowly towards deeper waters. Around 7 p.m., another distress call came from their cargo ship Haugland Captain, which had lost power itself. One of the helicopters assisting Viking Sky was diverted to help the cargo ship, but it didn't affect the evacuation. At about 7:45 p.m., the tugboat Ocean Response was sent to Viking Sky to help tow it. By 9 p.m., all engines were working, and the ship was in deeper waters. They retrieved the damaged port anchor and released the starboard anchor. Ocean Response arrived at 2:45 a.m., but they postponed securing the tow lines until daylight due to rough weather. Tow lines were secured around 8:30 a.m., and by 9:15 a.m., the helicopter evacuation was stopped. In total, 460 passengers were rescued by helicopters throughout the night, and Viking Sky then headed toward Molde and arrived around 4:25 p.m. on March 24th. The Norwegian Safety Investigation Authority recorded 19 passenger injuries during the incident, one of which was serious. The injured passengers received initial care on board and were later transported to nearby hospitals and emergency centers for further treatment. One passenger was airlifted to a hospital in Bergen. Fortunately, no crew members were injured. Reports from witnesses and CCTV footage indicate that most of the ship and interior damage occurred either during or shortly after the blackout. Some windows on Deck 7 were cracked. A wave impact around 3 p.m. caused a door leading from the outside deck to the restaurant on Deck 2 to break. This is believed to be when most of the damage on the starboard side happened, including to lifeboat number 3, control stations for lifeboat davits, the gangway bracket, railings between Decks 2 and 3, and life jacket boxes. The starboard stabilizer also sustained damage. While the full extent of interior damage is not yet known, witness reports and the aforementioned CCTV footage have shown damage in the restaurant area, particularly after its door to the open deck was dislodged. Additionally, falling ceiling plates and unsecured furniture caused further damage throughout parts of the ship. Weather and sea conditions data for the MV Viking Sky incident was gathered from various sources, including weather reports, observations, and records like the voyage data recorder, video surveillance, and the deck logbook. Crew, passengers, and other relevant parties also provided observations and statements with eyewitness testimony. Before the ship departed Tromsø on March 21st, weather forecasts indicated strong winds and rough seas along its route. Gale force winds were expected on the southbound journey towards Bodø, increasing to storm force winds and significant wave height during the voyage towards Rørvik. Multiple weather reports and special alerts warned of severe conditions from Bodø to Hustadvika on March 23rd, the day of the incident. Storm force winds and high waves were forecasted for Hustadvika, a known hazardous area. Hustadvika, located between Bud and Kristiansand, is notorious for its dangerous conditions. Strong winds from the southwest to northwest create large, steep waves, especially during outgoing tides. This area is known for unpredictable and breaking surf. Official maritime documents, like the Admiralty's sailing directions and the Norwegian pilot guide, highlight the perilous nature of Hustadvika, emphasizing its challenging wave conditions. Electronic navigational charts did not include warnings about dangerous waves in Hustadvika at the time of the incident, but were updated later. Despite the challenging conditions, the MV Viking Sky followed the main fairway while crossing Hustadvika on the day of the incident. In the end, the accident on the MV Viking Sky happened because there wasn't enough oil in the lubricating tanks of all the working diesel generators. This, combined with the ship's movement in rough seas, led to the blackout. The investigation found problems related to how the ship was operated, technical issues, and organizational problems, all of which played a role in the blackout. It took 39 minutes from the blackout until both engines were working again, and the ship had enough power to move at a slow speed. This was a stressful situation because the ship's control system was complicated, and specific steps had to be taken in the right order. Insufficient training for the crew likely made the recovery process take even longer. When the MV Viking Sky left Tromsø on March 21, 2019, one of its 4 diesel generators wasn't working. This meant there wasn't a backup in case of problems, which goes directly against safety regulations. Because the ship didn't meet the required safety standards, it shouldn't have sailed from Tromsø under those conditions. It's why everyone involved is very, very lucky the outcome wasn't worse. Otherwise, we could have been looking at the 21st century's version of the Titanic disaster with a mass casualty event, forever changing the history books of death on the high seas.